Hello everyone, welcome to Dynamics 365 Business Central launch event. My name is Andi Winarko. I'm the Principal Program Manager for Dynamics 365 Business Central. And today I would like to show what's new in resource governance for Dynamics 365 Business Central Online. So the agenda for today's session is first, I will talk about the resource governance mission. And then I will tell you a little story about the resource governance history for Business Central Online, where we came from, where we are today, and where we are going in the future in increasing the elasticity, availability, and throughput for your workloads in the cloud. And then I will show you a little bit of illustration of what is a shared multi-tenant architecture where your workload will run in the cloud. And I will show you the biggest investment that we did last year, which is resource consumption tracking that allows us to improve a lot of areas in the elasticity of our service. And then one of the most recent improvement that we will announce with this release is a new operational limits that will be previewed throughout this next quarter. And I will, at the end, I will show you the preview practicalities. What can you expect throughout this preview period? So without further ado, let's talk about the resource governance mission. So the mission for resource governance in Business Central Online is to offer optimal and fair resource consumption to all Dynamics 365 Business Central Online customers. Optimal means we want to offer maximal availability and performance for all resource consumption with minimal redundancy, minimal idle resources, right? Fair means we want to treat all customers and their user equally with respect to capacity and at the same time proportionally with respect to the licenses. We want to ensure that all our customers and their user can consume how and what they can consume in their entitled manners, what they are entitled to consume, which is the license-specific features, how much. We want to ensure that they can consume as much as possible, as long as it is covered by their licenses. This is where we will introduce a new concept that does not exist in Business Central Online before, which is called entitlement quotas. We are planning to introduce this concept of quotas in the next few semesters from now. And how fast can they consume? We want to ensure they can consume resources. When I'm talking about resources, it means like web service request resources, compute resources, storage resources. We want to allow or ensure customer can consume as fast as possible. We want to give top speed to all users as long as their consumption does not adversely impact others. And this is the concept that you are already familiar with, which is called operational limits. So before I go on, I would like to give a quick introduction of what the difference between quotas and limits, because sometimes people confuse them. So a quota in governance terminology, quotas are like entitlements or rights where customer and their user can claim or exercise those rights, while limits are laws or rules that you need to follow. So essentially, when you want to exercise your right or you want to claim your entitlement, you can do that as long as you follow the laws and rules, right? At the user level, quotas are tiered. That means like different licenses has different level of quotas, right? And they are cumulative. That means in a customer, when you buy more licenses, the amount of quota are accumulated such that all users in that environment can actually consume those cumulative quotas. And also transferable. It's if one user doesn't use his quota, other user cannot use more than what that's entitled for his license, right? For limits, it's actually different. For limits, they are fixed. That means that all users have the same amount of limit that they have to follow. And they are equal, applicable to all users, and non-transferable. That means if one user for example, follow the speed limit of a web service request. Let's say we have 1,000 requests per minute, and they submit a request for 500. Does not mean the next user can submit like 1,500. Everybody has to follow the same limit, which is 1,000 requests per minute, for example. Okay. So now let me tell you a little of history of where we came from. Our story started really recently in 2018, where there's a general availability of Dynamics 365 Business Central Online. In that year, we lifted and shifted Business Central into Azure to run on a shared multi-tenant architecture, a software as a service or a SaaS architecture. When we built this Elastic service, we actually followed the traditional technique for elasticity, which is mounting environments on multiple server instances or multiple VMs or hosts, right? Balancing workloads across those many hosts that mounted, and grouping hosts or servers to serve different environments, and also adding new hosts, which is scaling out. So these four techniques, which is mounting, balancing, grouping, and scaling, are what I fondly call the four horsemen of elasticity, right? So when we are building our Elastic service, at the same time, we actually already must govern resource consumption in the cloud. So we started with very conservative operational limits, and we don't really introduce a definite quota. So right now, we don't have we still have an indefinite quotas, right? And recently, last year, we started to track resource consumption. So basically, we want to track all type of workload and capacity unit. For example, number of tasks, number of requests, number of session, execution time, memory consumption, storage consumption, all those capacity unit we want to track for every user, for every environment, and for every customer at any given moment and period. This allows us to lay the foundation to improve our elasticity techniques. So as our service mature, we are actually able to start creating more intelligent mounting, intelligent balancing, grouping, and scaling, as well as offer more expansive limits and quantifiable quotas. So let me show just a quick illustration of what is a shared and multi-tenant architecture is. We start with the compute layer. Imagine there's a compute cluster that has each cluster has many virtual machine or hosts, right? And all of those hosts can share, can be grouped into different host groups. And on the storage layer, we have a database server where inside the server you can have multiple pools, which are resources shared by separate tenant databases. Right? So imagine you have, let's say you have four environments, T1, T2, T3, and T4, that actually sharing the same host resources, and they are connecting to the separate tenant databases in the database layer. Right? So if you notice, when we're starting, for example, tenant 2, tenant 3, and tenant 4, they are needing more computer resources, you can actually mount those environment on more hosts. For example, in the second host, you're mounting tenant 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then they're connecting to their own tenant database in the database server, right? And you can do the same when you have more compute resources needed for those tenants. And you can see in this picture, tenant environment 3, 4, and 5 are actually mounted on 3 hosts. That means they actually have the resources of 3 hosts. Now, if you actually notice, for example, tenant database 4 and 5 needing more juices, for example, they are running long-running queries, you can actually upgrade their pool such that they're going to a different pool that has more resources for those databases. So in this picture, T4 and T5 tenant databases are moving to pool 2 that should have less density and more resources for long-running queries, for example. And you can do the same, scaling independently compute layer from the database layer. In this case, let's say tenant 4 and 5 need more compute resources. We can see that we only have 3 hosts in the compute cluster. We can actually scale out and add more hosts, like 2 more hosts, and then you can actually mount and T4 and T5 and group them in this new group of hosts. So in that case, T4 and T5 will have more juice, more compute resources to run, for example, parallel tasks, parallel web service requests, etc. So that's a quick introduction of a shared multi-tenant architecture, right? So let's talk about the resource consumption tracking. When we do actually able to track all the resource consumption, you can see in this picture, right? The cluster that I mentioned before is like this big rectangular diagram. And inside each of this inside of this cluster, you have all these resources. So you have the NST, which is the server instance to run your workload. You have gateway that handle your web service requests, et cetera, et cetera. The first thing that we do is actually create a new service, which is called local consumption tracker. And this local consumption tracker are really there to implement operational limits. So it actually tracks all consumption of resources per user and per environment in each cluster. The next service that we create for consumption tracking is the global consumption tracker. And this service is really instrumental to implement entitlement quotas in the future. The job of global consumption tracker is to basically aggregate all resource consumption from local consumption tracker, the LCTs in each cluster, and aggregate it across the whole tenant, and then apply it to the customer-wide quotas. Okay? So what we gain with consumption tracking is essentially in a lighter side, we kind of like going from no or not having any or short-term memory into having a long-term memory. So like the myth that they're saying, like goldfish has no memory and elephant has a long-term memory. We are actually turning Business Central Online from a goldfish into an elephant, because now we actually can remember all type of consumption patterns for each tenant. For an illustration, I can show you one of this diagram. For example, in this diagram, we know that like one tenant in a tracking period for 1 hour between noon and 1 p.m. is actually only peaking at 12:10. So you can see it doesn't actually consume resources all the time. There are only peak period where it consumes more than other times, right? Now, if you have all this type of consumption pattern for multiple tenants, you can actually group those tenant or environment that doesn't peak at the same time, such that they don't overlap when they have a burst consumption. In this case, when you have more and more tenants, you can actually put them together in a resources where the resources are actually sufficient to support all these tenants. For example, in 20 tenants, you don't really need 20 times peak consumption, because if you make sure that their consumption pattern does not overlap, then you can actually manage an optimal resource governance for these tenants. Okay? So now, let me talk about the key improvement areas that are enabled by this, by the new resource consumption tracking. The first thing that we are able to do is offering an operational limit that are fair and expansive. First, we will publish a clear user-based limit. If you probably notice, most of our operational limits are environment-based, right? Now we're going to publish a clear user-based limit that protect our service, ensure fairness among users, and inspire elasticity and scalability. The ETA for this new user-based limit will be throughout this next quarter, which is fourth quarter of calendar year 2023, right? And at the same time, under the hood, we're also applying a dynamic resource-based limit. This is not published, but this is something that we use underneath our service to make sure that our service are always scalable, is protected, and ensure fairness among customer and environments. So the user-based limits are there to ensure fairness among users, while the resource-based limits are there to ensure fairness among customers or environments. And this is ongoing and continuous improvement throughout the year. Okay? The second thing that we are able to improve with the resource consumption tracking is, like I mentioned before, we are able to improve the elasticity techniques. So we can actually do intelligent balancing, mounting, grouping, and scaling. Because the consumption pattern and the limit exhaustion signals can be used to actually distribute or rebalance workload more intelligently across mounted hosts and mount more environment on more hosts, group hosts differently. For example, like heavy consuming tenant will go with the less heavy consuming tenant, such that they can actually balance each other out, for example. And you can also like use the signal of limit exhaustion operation and consumption pattern to scale out and add more hosts into the cluster. So the aim is we want to make sure that we exploit all this technique before you actually throttle. Throttle, which should be as a last resort if we cannot actually expand our service to accommodate your workload, right? And this is continuous ongoing improvement throughout the year. And finally, we want to introduce entitlement quotas and flexible access consumption. And we will publish a user-based and tenant-wide quotas for licensed and unlicensed user, respectively, and allow buying access consumption. This should be estimated happening in the next 2 or 3 semesters from now. The aim is 99% of our customer will be able to consume resources under their quota. Not a lot of them will exceed it, but for some of the customer who wants to exceed their consumption, we'll allow them option to buy more add-on capacity or pay as you go for their excess consumption. So all this improvement will be applied in many different type of resources. We'll focus more on the web service request handling resources first, computer resources next, and then later on the database or storage resources. So let's talk about the new operational limits that's coming this quarter, okay? Before I talk about what's the new operational limits that's coming, let me introduce you the concept of operational limit. Because there are 3 types of operational limits that we can actually use to govern resources in the cloud. There are essentially, for a complete governance, you need a speed limit, concurrency limit, and execution time limit. For this, I'd like to use a loose analogy of a highway management, traffic management. Okay, if you imagine a stretch of a highway as a limited server or host capacity, traversing that highway represent consuming a portion of that capacity. And cars in that highway represent workloads submitted by our customer and their users. In this case, the customer or user are color-coded, like blue customer, green, orange, and yellow, right? So in this case, in this analogy, all users should enter or merge their traffic into the highway at a certain speed limit. They should not exceed that speed limit, right? And then higher toll charges that you pay for represent how far you can go. So that's actually representing the premium licenses that you can buy to consume more quotas. So first, let me introduce what is a speed limit means. In speed limits, speed limit essentially in the highway analogy is to control how fast cars enter to the highway. So in Business Central Online or in software as a service, it is to control how fast workloads enter our system. So if all cars are entering the highway more or less under the speed limit, you can actually imagine the highway capacity will fill up with more or less the same number of blue cars, green cars, yellow, or orange, right? When the capacity is filled up, you might want to redirect traffic to another accessible highway. That is representing rebalancing workload in our BC Online, right? And then, or you might actually want to opening up more highway that accessible for certain customer. That's represent mounting more environment to more hosts in a cluster, or even, for example, dedicating some highway for just blue or orange car. That's essentially grouping those workloads that need more resources, for example. And finally, you can basically build a new highway from scratch, which represents scaling out in our BC Online world. Okay. So the next concept is a concurrency limit. By the way, speed limit and concurrency limits already exist in our Business Central Online. It just right now it's still on a per environment basis. So we will introduce a per user basis later on. So in the concurrency limit, essentially imagine all cars are entering the highway more or less under the speed limit, but there are blue cars that coming from different entry point. So you end up with more blue cars at the same time in the highway, and that cannot be controlled with speed limit. So we have to introduce a new limit, which is concurrency limit, to control how many cars are present at any given moment in the highway or in our role in BC Online to control how many workloads are concurrently processed in the system. Now, we actually already have this speed limit and concurrence limit. What we are missing that in the future that we would like to introduce is a new limit, which is called execution time limit. So imagine in this highway analogy, when you have cars coming in at under the speed limit, and they are actually not entering the highway from multiple entry points, but some of these cars are actually stretch limousine or a long trailer or truck. And you can imagine in the capacity of the highway fill up with this long stretch blue car. So that's represent essentially a long-running workload in our system. So we need a new limit, an additional to speed and concurrency limit, which is execution time limit, to control how long workload are processed in our system. So the preview that's coming this next quarter is first, in the early quarter, next quarter, we will actually upgrade the old concurrency limit for scheduled tasks from 3 concurrently running tasks per environment into 5 concurrently running tasks per user. So you can imagine now, if you have more user in the environment, the throughput for your environment can get bigger. If you have, for example, you have 2 users, you can run like a 10 scheduled tasks in parallel. Or if you have 3 users, you can run 15 tasks in parallel. Previously, you can only run 3 per environment. So this is a huge increase in the throughput for your workload, okay? The next improvement that we're planning is actually changing the speed limit from the old, for web service requests, from the old 600 requests per environment per minute into actually 6,000 requests per user in the previous 5-minute sliding window. So this actually gives you flexibility to have a burst peak of requests. For example, if you want to have in the first minute to have 6,000, you can do that. As long as you make sure that across a 5-minute sliding window, you maintain the number of requests in that period. Okay, so that is coming in the mid-quarter, which is around November, December timeline, right? And finally, another concurrency limit that we will introduce is also for web service requests. And this time, we're not changing the number too much. What we're changing is the denominator of this limit. So before, we are allowing only 10 concurrently handled web service requests, where 5 is processed and 95 queued per environment. Now we're actually allowing per user. So we are opening up the parallel web service requests. 100, the same number, 100 concurrently handled, 5 processed, and 95 queued, but per user. So that means when you have environment with more users, you get more throughput. That's the last improvement for this quarter that we're aiming at the end of this quarter. Okay? And finally, in the future, you can expect the introduction of the execution time limit that I mentioned before. For example, if we have like a server instance with like 4 cores, right? In the 5-minute elapsed time of sliding window, that 4 core actually allow 4 times 5, 20-minute execution time. So within that 20-minute execution time, what is the X minute that we allow per user to consume? And then underneath that, under the hood, we will actually make sure that each environment does not consume up to Y% of the total execution time or Z% of the total execution time in a cluster. So those are limits that coming in the future that we plan for incoming releases. So finally, I would like to show the preview practicalities. What can you expect throughout this preview period? So throughout October, November, December, we are actually making sure that this operational limit are continue to be monitored and fine-tuned to provide higher throughput than the old one. So expect it to change a lot. It's subject to change, right? And the throughput will not be increased in a big bang manner, right? Like you will not see, like, for example, currently you are only run 3 concurrent tasks per environment. And suddenly you will see like an unlimited number of tasks in parallel per environment, right? That's not going to happen, but we're going to do it gradually. So we will do a gradual throughput increase. Let me just give you an illustration. For example, we will increase it from 3 to 6 or 9 parallel tasks per environment. And then we monitor the situation, and then we keep increasing it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. We keep continuing increasing until we have an optimal throughput that we can provide, right? And that is essentially what we plan. So we want to make sure that we communicate those incremental increase of throughput throughout the quarter, throughout the preview period. We'll announce any changes in our release plan. So watch out for the minor 23.x releases, and also in our documentation, especially the operational limit documents, because there's going to be a lot of updates in the document throughout the period. Okay? And finally, we always appreciate your feedback and suggestion. Please use our Yammer channel to contact us, to tell us what have you been monitoring and what you see in terms of your throughput for your workloads, right? And give us feedback and suggestion. So continue getting back to us using the Yammer, our documentation, our Twitter, and also please join us, sign up for BC Office Hour, especially if it's relevant with the resource governance upgrades in the future. So thank you, and with that, that concludes our session. I look forward to seeing you soon in the Q&A sessions remotely and also in person in Directions Conference. Thank you for your attention. See you soon.